And let's pray together as we come to God's word. Father, help us, please, as we come to your word now. Please guide us in our thinking. Please might we hear what you are saying. Please might we know its truth and its goodness. And please might we live in line with it, we ask. Amen. Well, I want to begin with this book. It's got this enticing title, I think, Liquid Love. And then that picture of a heart on the sand. So it's about love, but about the idea you just kind of get washed away very easily. The book describes relationships in life today, how we approach them, how we think about them. And the key idea is this: it's that we all want love. We all want closeness, intimacy, and so on, companionship. But we want that love to be liquid. We want it to be able to flow wherever we like, rather than being kind of fixed and set down, tied down. Because that feels restricting. That feels limiting, inhibiting. We want to be free, as some kind of popular phrases say it today. We want to be free to be me. Now that's true of all relationships in many ways, but it's particularly true then of romantic relationships and then of marriage. I came across some advice in an Agony Aunt column just recently, and somebody said, you should be able to exercise your freedom and your happiness in a way that benefits you. You see the idea of freedom there. Now, I must be free to be myself, and no one must impose on me or limit me. That is how our culture tends to think about freedom today. It is always freedom from restriction, freedom to be myself. But frankly, it has led simply to mess and confusion in relationships. And into that mess, Jesus speaks. He speaks specifically about God's design for marriage. The first thing we see in this passage is the goodness of the original design. See verse 3. Some Pharisees came to him to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Back then, there were some people saying you could divorce your wife for anything, any reason. I mean, you just don't like their cooking or something. Just get rid of them. There were others who said, no, you can divorce, but it has to be a much more substantive reason than that. This was a debate of the day, and hence the question to Jesus. But Jesus goes back to God's original design. Verse 4, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? Haven't you read Genesis? Yeah, of course they'd read Genesis. Haven't you realized what God said? He's saying he made them male and female, and we should note on the way past, Jesus believes there are two genders, which is contested today, and that marriage is then the uniting of these two complementary genders. Verse 5, and God said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. God makes us male and female, complementary, and that lies behind marriage, where the two become one. They are sort of fused together. That one flesh idea is both pictured and enacted in sex, which is why sex is then only for marriage. But it's a much deeper and broader idea than that. A couple become united in a most profound way. The two become one. And this is foundational to marriage and profoundly shaping of marriage. When Karis and I ever do marriage preparation or marriage discussion sessions with people, we always look at this side. Sorry, I think I glitched out there a second. We'll look at this idea of one flesh, and we'll go around and ask people, well, what's an implication? You know, if you're one flesh, what difference would that make? One person said, it's no longer you and me, it's us forever. You think differently because life. Someone said it's not about bartering between two people, negotiating. You are one now. Or someone said it gets rid of a transactional view of marriage. You know, who's giving what? Am I giving more than you? No, we're one. It is a profoundly shaping picture of marriage. And it's a picture of intimacy and closeness, union, partnership, bonding. This is God's original design. Now Jesus is quoting here from Genesis chapter 2, and that is before what we call the fall and the arrival of sin and the world. And once that arrives, of course, this original design gets twisted. The perfect union and perfect closeness that was pictured isn't perfect anymore. I've sometimes used the analogy of a three-legged race with people. You know, in a three-legged race, you get tied to somebody, literally tied with your legs and arms around them, and you then try and run together. And as you do that, if you are perfectly in time, it actually works quite well. You can run quite reasonably. But if you're not, you pull against each other. You stumble. You even fall. That's kind of how marriage can work now. It can work so wonderfully well when you're in harmony, in time, and yet you can pull on each other. And that very bond between you is almost what causes it to hurt. But Jesus knows that about marriage. He knows he's talking after the fall. And when asked about divorce and about the idea of cutting the bonds between you, not being tied anymore, he goes back to the original design. He says, verse 6, so they are no longer two but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. I say those words at every marriage service I conduct, and for me, they are the high point of the marriage. These two here, these two people, they're no longer two. They are one because God has bound them together. And if he's joined them, then no one better go around separating them. You see, they ask, can we divorce for any and every reason? And Jesus basically says, I don't believe in divorce. God's behind marriage. God's joined them together. God's made them one flesh. Don't you go against what God has done. Now, Jesus is going to talk about the possibility of divorce in a moment, so we're going to get to that, okay? But we must appreciate what he is saying here first. there's an original design for marriage. One flesh, lifelong union. And we need to believe in the goodness of that original design. We need to challenge that idea of liquid love in our society, the way it thinks about freedom. See, freedom, where it's all about what I think is best for me and expressing me, that's actually ultimately toxic to relationships. It undermines closeness. It's actually only within the solid commitment of relationship that true intimacy can flourish and I can truly be me.
So I don't mean by all of this then that like married couples have to spend all their time together, kind of have time by themselves or something like that. I don't mean that, of course. What I mean is we mustn't think of ourselves as an individual asking how to, kind of having a negotiated relationship with another individual. No, we are two. We mustn't believe the world's message that faithful marriage is kind of right but dull, limiting or boring. Those of you who are married, give yourself to this one flesh togetherness. God has joined you together. Live that out, cherish each other, honor each other. Two halves of a whole. Those of you who are single, think of marriage like this, know its significance, promote and encourage marriage like this. Now, we don't elevate marriage into the only state worth having. Jesus will talk about singleness in a moment, but this is God's design for marriage, and it is not simply right, it is good. It is not simply true, it is beautiful. Now, because I've changed computer, we've lost my heading. So my first heading was the goodness of the original design. My second heading would come up on the screen if I had it. It's the sad reality of divorce. Verse 7. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? If God's plan, in other words, was this lifelong one flesh stuff, why does Moses command divorce? And they're referring to a passage earlier in the Bible about Moses talking about giving a certificate of divorce. And Jesus replies, verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. Now notice Jesus actually corrects them first. He uses a different word. Moses didn't command divorce at all. He permitted divorce. And it was because of hardness of heart. So God recognizes that sin from hard hearts wrecks relationships, and he recognizes it can wreck marriages to the extent that divorce can be an option. Always a sad option, but not then a wrong option. And Jesus is saying that sin still wrecks relationships, and he's kind of agreeing with that. But see how he goes on in verse 9. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Sin wrecks relationships such that divorce and remarriage is permitted, but he's limiting when that is the case. He's saying it's only when there's sexual immorality, when someone has broken the marriage bond by going and having sex, which pictures that one flesh union with somebody else. You see, they're debating how broad the terms for divorce could be, and Jesus is limiting them and narrowing them. He's saying divorce can come, but only when marriage is split by something as significant as this. And so for Jesus, divorce is a sad reality in some cases. It is not an easy get out clause. Now, look, I need to say at this stage that the times and circumstances where divorce and remarriage are considered permissible by Bible-believing Christians varies. That people debate this. Okay, some people say it's only what Jesus mentions here. It's only sexual immorality. There is then, unfortunately, a debate about what counts as sexual immorality. Now, is it sex with somebody else, or kind of what counts as sex? And you get into unfortunate discussions. The Apostle Paul, I think, says in 1 Corinthians that if a spouse is abandoned by somebody and the marriage bond is broken in that way, that the person is free to remarry. I think a good case can be made for situations like abuse. The outworking then about when it is permitted, that takes thought. There is debate over it. I'm not going to list all the possibilities here. Jesus's point is to say that divorce is a sad reality, but to limit it because he thinks most of the time people will stay married. He is still reasserting God's original design. He's putting it forward not as like a theoretical ideal, but as perfectly possible. Now, I'm conscious that some listening may have been divorced, and the situation and circumstances will vary. You may have been completely innocent, very guilty, somewhere in between. And some people can feel a real stigma because of divorce, and they can feel it particularly in churches. I just want to say, we don't want anyone to feel stigmatized at Grace. What we want to do is we want to push and celebrate and emphasize good marriage as Jesus is putting it forward here. And we want to recognize that divorce is a sad reality, and we want to welcome and love anyone, no matter what their relational baggage. And look, let's be honest, we all have some sort of baggage. Jesus recognizes the sad reality of divorce, but he doesn't want them to think of it as an easy escape route because marriage isn't as fulfilling as I hoped, or it's harder than I thought. He wants to limit it and say, stay married. And if you're struggling in marriage, please listen to Jesus here. I know it can be painful. I've been with couples who felt like they were at each other's throats, and it can feel hopeless sometimes. Jesus is saying there are moments, but I expect you to stay married. That's the basic expectation. God's good design can work. He's encouraging us to make it work. And so this leads to my third heading, which is the need to accept what Jesus is saying. See verse 10. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. If permanent marriage is the norm, and they understand what Jesus is saying there, if there are only very limited exceptions, perhaps singleness would be better, Jesus. Now, Jesus' reply has, I think, been often misunderstood here. We're going to have to think carefully for a second. Look at verse 11. Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it's been given. What is this word? No, not everyone can accept this word. What's the word? What's the message, the idea? Well, I think we instinctively read it meaning what Jesus has been saying about marriage. So not everyone can accept this message of permanence in marriage, only those to whom it's being given. Only those, as it were, with the gift for marriage should get married because it is so hard. That's, I think, how we can instinctively read it. But then Jesus goes on, verse 12, to talk about eunuchs and singleness, and it's an explanation of what he's just been saying, and I don't think it quite flows. When he says not everyone can accept this word, he could easily just be referring back to what the disciples have just said. It's better to be single, isn't it, Jesus? Not everyone can accept that idea of it better being single. And I think it makes more sense that that is what he's responding to. And that's what makes more sense of verse 12. Not everyone can accept the idea of staying single, for there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Being a eunuch is a way of picturing being single and celibate. And Jesus has these three categories. Some are born that way, unable to have sex for whatever medical reason. Some are made eunuchs. Men were castrated to work in certain settings like royal courts and things. And some choose to live like eunuchs. They choose to live single, celibate lives for the sake of the kingdom. Are people like the Apostle Paul, who stayed single and speaks about the advantages that that gives. And I think we can extend this, that in a sense, anyone who is not currently married is now called, for that time at least, to live a single celibate life. Or those who are attracted to the same sex but know what God's design in marriage is for men and women, and so choose to live a single celibate life. And they do it for the sake of the kingdom, because Jesus and his rule are what is most important. So the disciples say, if it's lifelong marriage with limited divorce, perhaps singleness is better. And Jesus basically replies, well, singleness is a gift. It's pretty hard. The point, I think, is that we have to accept Jesus's teaching and choose between his two options. There is lifelong marriage, one flesh union. There's singleness and celibacy. And we need to accept those rather than create a third or a fourth or a fifth or whatever we might do. And we do it in a culture that will tell us not to be so limited. Don't be constrained by such outdated ideas. You know, express yourself, enjoy yourself, be true to yourself. Whether that means staying in a marriage or leaving a marriage or having an affair or sleeping around, whatever it means for you. And Jesus says, there is a maker of this world and of us who made relationships and marriage, and there is an original design. Accepting Jesus' words means committing ourselves to these two paths, marriage or singleness. No other options. Yes, there's the sad reality of divorce when it comes. We weep over that, but then we look to stay on one of the two paths. We commit ourselves. And we believe that Jesus knows what he's talking about, that God's design is good, not limiting. You know, we want to believe that he's not just right, he knows what's best. That what we can feel like limitations and restrictions are what actually will let us live well and actually let us truly be us. It's like the limitations of the train track that means the train runs smoothly, or the limitations of the string that the kite is attached to that means it flies well. Yes, limitations, but limitations for good and flourishing. And so if you're married, look to persuade yourself that the best thing for you is close one flesh union with your spouse. Don't look over his or her shoulder, wondering what might have been or what could yet be. Be careful with your daydreams and ponderings. God has united you to this person. Bind yourself to them. And if you're single, look to persuade yourself that the best thing for you is to stay away from sex until you might get married. And that is best for you now and best for your future marriage if you ever have one. God knows what he's doing. There is an original design. We need to believe Jesus knows what he's talking about. Let's have a moment's quiet just to reflect.